Good morning. My name is Dan Brown, and I'm an associate professor here at the Siegel Design Institute. And I'll be speaking with you today about differentiation by design, a process that I'm researching to contextualize it. I call it the how of using design thinking in business. First, we're going to go through some basic concepts. One key concept is that I believe that for designers, we have to have a design ethos. This ethos embodies the process of seeking to know what you don't know as you storm through this creative problem-solving process. This ethos has been described by other researchers, primarily Nigel Cross in the UK, where he talks about designerly ways of doing things. In essence, it's the way we are trained to creatively problem solve that's different than many of the other functional activities in business. Designers are creative problem solvers at most, empathic need finders, lifelong learners, sustainably driven, servant leaders of the design process. The next key concept is that multiple opportunities exist early in the design process through differentiation. And differentiation is defined as what the organization or the company can create that is different than the competition that adds value to the customer getting experience. This opportunity exists at the front end, and at the front end it's important to understand that if you do not seek to look for opportunity in the front end of the design process, you lose opportunity to further differentiate the product. When you research this in the activity space of how the users use the product and how other stakeholders are involved, it gives rise to insights. You need to do this front-end research before you choose what to design or what pathways to pursue, because it's a bit of the cart before the horse of trying to jump into the product development without researching the activities in the space that you're going into. Customers hire a product to do a job, and we're looking in design to really try to find a way to solve the problem in a way that's differentiated from the competition, that adds value, such that your unique problem-solving capability in your design positions you in a competitive advantage against the other products. In addition to just the opportunity existing, I found that many opportunities exist if you seek the insights from all stakeholders. By this I mean looking beyond the user, but looking into the supply chain, the distribution channel, the business model, how the product affects other people, how the product is created, and how the product is reused at the end of life. We call this the consumption chain, from the beginning to the end of the life of the product, how it touches everybody in the experience. Identifying those unmet business needs beyond form and function, meaning that form and function is the traditional bastion of design, but there are many opportunities to find unmet needs that augment that customer getting ability in design. So we're looking for those unmet needs in business beyond form and function. And obviously these needs have to be differentiatable so that they add value and that they need to be complementary. Another key concept that this opportunity is lost when the development process approaches launch without seeking this differentiation. This often happens in companies where people are in a rush to get a product out, particularly in breakthrough products when the unknown aspect of the challenge is that you don't know what you don't know, and you have a solid deadline, and you're working very hard to create differentiation, to try to find a new and better way of doing things, but you're on a hard deadline. And sometimes the deadline becomes the precedent and the differentiation gets lost in the shuffle. As you do that, the closer you get to the launch date, the loss of opportunity will impede the ability for that product to compete in the marketplace. Thus, opportunity is lost by not asking the right questions up front, rushing into the design at the beginning of the process before knowing the right problem to work on. Oftentimes, companies will pursue the wrong problem. Another key concept is that the business goal is to create new value through design. Now, we have design and business typically are separate functions. There's a very popular opportunity in business today about design thinking, how design thinking can influence business. It surely can, but it's much more than the simple fad of discussing design thinking or taking a couple seminars. There's this whole process of value creation based on design thinking that we're going to discuss today. So the business goal is to create new value through design across the value chain that the customer is willing to pay for. So this new value is captured by pursuing the right problems up front, where solutions add value beyond the competition. You need to create competitive advantage that the customer is willing to pay for. And finally, another key concept is together business and design inform each other to create new value and competitive advantage. Opportunity is multiplied in this process. When design informs business on opportunity and methodologies to create new value, and when business informs design on opportunities for that new value to be created. To differentiate these from the competition, we have form and function, typically arising out of design, but also we have the ability to differentiate, as I said previously, in the supply chain, the distribution channel, and in the business model. This creates multiple value propositions for the organization and multiple competitive advantages to use in the marketplace against the competition. So while design profoundly contributes to the business thinking and strategy, it needs to be acknowledged that business needs also profoundly contribute to the design process. Thus, value creation, competitive advantage is created throughout the process as designers think to discover differentiated, novel, new experiences based on sustainable value creation that the customer is willing to pay for. In this next section, we're going to see how design reveals itself to the marketplace. First way design typically will reveal itself to a user is as a unique source identifier, where the user recognizes what the product is simply by the identity that they see. The second is function. Customers hire a product to do a job, and solving that job in the most cost-effective way is typically what'll drive a user to your product. A unique problem solver is a strong source of competitive advantage. Third is experience. Experience is arising as a new metric for product design. It's about creating a new meaning for users beyond form and function. Experience is often the basis of brand building, long-term relationships with your product in the marketplace. And finally, sustainability, which was not always considered part of the design process in the past. But I think I will be able to show you through this process that economic, social, environmental sustainability is an integral part of the design process. And if it's not taken as an integral part of the process, it will not be considered in the overall value proposition when the product goes into the marketplace. Form, the quote that I like about form was from Buckminster Fuller. He said, "When I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty, but when I've finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong." And that has been my experience in design. As I design a product, though I've got a number of awards for product design and industrial design, I typically follow a functional approach to optimize that problem-solving ability. That takes me down a pathway of creating a unique problem solver that also often has a unique embodiment. I then take and design the form out of that unique embodiment, and it drives me into a unique form factor, leveraging the form and function in a synergistic fit. And above all, it must be simple. Regarding function, I don't think we can get better than Albert Einstein, and look at his quote as, "Any intelligent fool can make things better, more complex and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot more courage to move in the opposite direction." What Einstein was passionately involved in his design and his research was simplicity. And simplicity, though it reveals itself as obvious many times when people see that, the pathway to simplicity is often very difficult, and it takes a lot of work and effort to take a complex problem and get to a simple solution. Einstein recognized that and talked about that often in his discussions. Experience. I like the Charles Eames quote. Charles Eames is a designer of furniture, and much of his furniture today is still ever present in our society. He said, "Eventually everything connects people, ideas, objects. The quality of connections is the key to quality per se." I believe Eames was saying there that it's the combination of form and function and those intangible aspects of behavior that map onto what that experience is, to what each individual experiences individually with that product, that gets them to either like the product or dislike the product. And finally, sustainability. Sustainability is a new concept in design, and it really is sort of the white space for opportunity in design to differentiate products that before were not considered sustainable. Thomas Sandel said, the definition for sustainability is solutions which meet the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to fulfill their own needs. And looking at sustainability beyond the normal environmental sustainability, but into the aspects of social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So the question is how? Is there a design process that forms the basis of design thinking in product and service design? And what is the how of the design thinking movement? I will go on to further discuss 10 principles that I've developed that are the how, what I believe to be the how of the design thinking movement. Now moving on to the 10 principles of differentiation by design. This is an overview of the 10 principles. We'll go into each one of those individually. The first principle is you need to determine if you're solving a real problem. And the question is, are you pursuing a real problem, not simply an idea looking for a solution? And this is key because I quite often see teams and even in industry, people rushing into the design process without first investigating the problem and framing it in a way that the consumers are perceiving their needs. And quite often when that happens, you can have a great technical breakthrough, or you can have done a lot of great work, but you don't match with the consumer's needs in the marketplace. When someone else comes in, they can steal that need from you and you're going to be displaced. I'd like to perceive it in this way from a framework perspective. Theodore Levitt, who was an economist and a professor at Harvard, moved into the marketing area and tried to understand consumer behavior and how value is created. And he came up and with this quote that is quite often used, people do not buy a quarter-inch drill, they buy a quarter-inch hole. Now what was Levitt saying by that? He was saying that you need to look at the problem to be solved when you are designing for a user. Focusing on a drill, as many engineering projects would, we may look for better steels, better coatings, other ways of drilling that hole, but a designer in his framing goes beyond the obvious. What designers do is they look at, is there a better way to do this? Can we do this with a water jet? Can we do it with a laser? Can we stamp these in small sheets and stack them up to create the hole that we're looking for? Can we put acid on top of a rock and start drilling it as it gets soft? Even possibly abstractly saying, how does a woodpecker do it? Reframing the question in that context allows a myriad of opportunities to come forward for us to differentiate and design into a white space. Thus, how we do this is we gather facts, ethnographic research, which is about going into the field, looking at how the customers are currently solving a job and trying to identify those unmet needs that they themselves can't express. Looking at the business case, understanding how competitors are in the marketplace, what the value they put on this problem, and what is the benchmark for price anchors, et cetera, that are necessary for us to meet. We need to frame and reframe the question, as we said, is there other ways of solving the problem that may be more efficient or allow for a differentiator that you can leverage in the market? You want to challenge assumptions because there are many preconceived notions about the way things can be done, that designers can bring up a new way of doing things that in itself is a novel idea. You need to look at multiple perspectives. You need to avoid the unintended consequences of design. And you may have to make sure that as a leader in the design process that everyone in your team is on the same page. This is a great sort of a cartoon about the design process and understanding the problem from the beginning. This was based on a software development. And if you look at this cartoon, in the first caption it says how the customer explained it. The second caption is how the project was understood. The third caption is how the analyst designed it. Fourth is how the programmer wrote it. Fifth here is how the business consultant described it. Bottom left, sixth here is how the project was documented, what operations intended, how the customer was billed, how the product was supported, and finally, what the customer really intended. Now, this is obviously a cartoon, but if people that have been in the marketplace can get quite a little laugh on this because we've all been here before. We've been here before because in the race to get things done, in the pressures of what's going on in the context of our daily lives and our work lives, we are always in a rush. But stopping to pause to understand and define the problem is critical in the process, because you could spend a lot of time, effort, and resources working on the wrong problem. And we want to avoid that. So understanding what the problem is from the beginning is very important. An example of this would be the Segway. The Segway, by anybody's calculation, was a phenomenal technical achievement in engineering. But when you look at it as a product, it's been a failure in the marketplace. And when looking at researching why it was a failure, the consensus is that the expectations were unrealistic. The way the Segway was positioned in the market was to be a people mover that was going to, surpass anything out there in the market. They were comparing it to cars and public transportation, but they didn't really compare it to bicycles or even motorcycles. The design was focused on the product, not the solution. And that caused the focus to be on the technical achievement, but not what the customer would be willing to pay for. Sorry, it was not clear that there was not clear use of early validation. That means prototypes were not used early on to go out to understand, in the context that the users will be using it, will the product survive in that marketplace? Will that product be accepted? Can the product even ride on the streets? And it was really an invention rather than a functional problem solver. Thus, when the Segway came into the marketplace, it found one major barrier to entry. And the barrier to entry was it was classified as a motor vehicle. And motor vehicles are adjudicated in local municipalities all over the country. And being classified as a motor vehicle, it found itself in a position between a bicycle and motor vehicles regarding the laws. And it was not, because of the design, allowed to go on the streets. Thus, it could not be used for transportation. And the Segway found itself in that market space, that gray area, of being a great breakthrough introduction of a product technology, but really not being able to be effective in the marketplace to compete. Another case of unintended consequences of the design is one I like to talk about, is a social design. And basically, Haiti was hit by a horrendous storm, as it gets occasionally, in the 90s. And when that storm hit, the Haitian people, the rice crop was destroyed, the Haitian people were starving, and as a country, President Clinton decided to send food aid to Haiti, which is, without a doubt, the right thing to do. But in doing that, President Clinton had talked to the rice farmers that were in Arkansas, which were his constituents for many years, and they decided, hey, we can not only feed them for today, but why don't we put together an FDA program of giving them rice for a number of years, and this will help them out. And it sounded logical, and it was really, had, I think, a duplicitous purpose. It was really, sounded good to help the Haitian people feed themselves in a cheaper way, but the unintended consequences were that the Haitian rice farmers, after the storm and after the recovery, could not compete in the marketplace against this low-cost rice. Thus, the Haitian rice farmers went out of business. So the good intentions of giving rice for a long term to Haiti turned into a disaster, because after the subsidy ended, Haiti could not feed itself because it could not grow rice because the farmers were all gone. These unintended consequences are prevalent in design, and they hit us from a number of different ways. And it must be, they must be taken into consideration from either a social engineering type design project through everyday consumer type products. This moves us on to principle number 2. Principle 2 is research the problem in each step of the consumption chain. That's after we first understand what the problem is, or we frame the problem or problems that we're working on, we then need to understand how the problems are currently being solved. So we need to research the problem to identify needs, and just not the needs of the user, but needs of all the stakeholders. This is often a point where design, again, falls down, as designers look myopically only at the user and don't take into consideration all the other influencers, purchasers, and stakeholders in this process. The way we do this is a consumption chain map, and we'll look at it a little closer on the next slide, is that we want to map this consumption chain. That means we want to look at all the touch points where the stakeholders interact with the product, so that we can understand what is happening now and look for opportunities to identify needs that we can design value creators in the future. After you map the chain, you want to analyze the customer's experience at each step. You're looking for the differences between what the competitions are doing, the different competitors in the market, and what potential differences you could bring to the market. You want to brainstorm new value propositions, and you would design a new value chain differentiators. And finally, as always in the design process, you need to validate or test your differentiators on users to make sure you're on the right track. So this is a sort of a daunting process, but it can be made easier when you first take it looking at the existing market space and how that problem is being solved now. And when you look at the existing market, you can understand these different stages of the consumption chain and simply record down what's happening. And when you do that recording, you can compare competitors to each other. And in doing that, you can look at how this maps onto the experience, the problem that you've identified. Now, not every one of these steps is going to lead to insights into new value creation. And not every project is the same. They have their own unique combination of value creators. Thus, it's this framework that you create of analyzing the consumption chain that allows you to brainstorm through the process at these particular areas, looking for points of pain with the customer that you can design in your new product or process in order to create that competitive advantage or new value that you're looking to use in the marketplace. This goes from awareness to search, et cetera. You can read on. Finally, to disposal. I like to say from the creation where the raw materials are created to where the product is reused in the marketplace. Today we think about the context of end of life as cradle to cradle. It's much more sustainable than cradle to grave, meaning going to the dump. And you can use any type of analysis. I like to use just a simple spreadsheet, and you can look across the top here. We have all the different steps of the consumption chain, which can change by analysis of your chain. You may have different titles up there. And you look at users, influencers, and purchasers, and you simply try to look at the needs or how those needs are being solved. How are they ordering the product? How are they using the product? How does the product hit the market? Who's building it? All the different steps that are touch points in this consumption chain. And then the hard work comes in, or the fun work, depending on your framework, is that you look at each of these opportunities to brainstorm. And when you brainstorm them, you're looking to see if the user's needs are being completely met here. Now, if the user's needs are being met, there's probably not an opportunity there with to design into a space. It's a competitive space, or they're being met. They become what I call a constraint. You need to meet them at least to the level of what the competition is. But there's sometimes, oftentimes, across the consumption chain where the needs are not being met in a way that is fully satisfying to the user or the customer. At those inflection points, you can design or brainstorm opportunities to meet those needs with your new design, thus differentiating that particular aspect of your product to the user. What typically happens is, it's a process here, it's a busy slide, but you have the consumption chain, you do the analysis, and you're looking to create a lean value chain. Value chain is the business name for what a professor named Porter talks about what the customer is paying for. Now, the value chain for each product really changes by product and by marketplace. But within the value chain, you can create those unique you can create those unique differentiators that add value. So when the customer is looking at your product versus other competitive products, they see a purpose to buy your product. Again, we talked about research in the consumption chain. You want to analyze the competitive space, you want to map it, you want to understand what the customers are paying for, and you want to seek differentiating opportunities. And in this process, you want to know what activities have you identified that can be a source of new competitive advantage. This is the essence of where you're going to focus on your project. If you rush off into the project and you have not identified needs across the consumption chain, you're probably going to converge basically on what's currently in the marketplace. And it's very difficult to launch a new product into a competitive space if you don't look any different than the competition. This process is an essence of understanding and identifying insights and the needs across the consumption chain that you can design into. Moving on to principle 3. Once you've identified the needs of the consumption chain, I believe these needs can break out into 3 particular areas: the functional needs, the emotional needs, and the constraints. First, we're going to talk about functional needs. So when researching and benchmarking existing competitive product solution, you need to identify those needs that are functional and that competitive products have set the benchmark for. If you design a new product that doesn't meet the accepted functional needs of the users in that market area, you're going to be perceived as lacking. So these are table stakes. These are the basic minimum viable product that you can design and bring it into the market. This is done through an analysis, through a journey mapping, through types of business research into the existing consumption chain for the competitive products so that you can identify these needs. And how we do this, we first identify what are the existing products. And then we're looking at what are the existing business or economic cost anchors involved with that product. What are the supply and distribution requirements of that market space? Well, if we're only myopically focused on the user and how they use the product, there may be supply chain or distribution channel requirements that are functional that we are not considering. We can hit the ball out of the park on use, but we cannot fit into the overall consumption chain of the product, and we fail because we had not looked into the complete stakeholder relationship with the product. And then these functional requirements tend to flow into the specifications, and there's a certain element of them that I call constraints. These are non-negotiable. A constraint is when you're going into the medical marketplace, and the medical marketplace is regulated, and you have to meet a certain regulation. There's no discussion in your product development whether you're going to meet that regulation or not. You must meet that. You put constraints at a certain point in your design challenge that must be met. And to try to negotiate or circumvent a constraint, particularly a standard in a marketplace, is just too difficult for any one project to take on. It takes a long time to establish a standard, and it's almost impossible to change them. So when you see standards in industries or certain regulations, you must design to them, or you choose not to go into that industry. And then government regulations, et cetera. The one pitfall here that is very often committed is that we'll design for the US regulations and standards, but we want to have an international product. Well, it doesn't make sense because if you only design to the US standards, and in the design and testing phase, you don't also get the qualifications for, say, the European standards or the Asian standards, your product will not be able to be exported in those markets. So in mapping that consumption chain, if you're going offshore, if you're creating an international product, you must understand the standards and regulations of those marketplaces. As you do that, you create engineering drawings, you look at the bill of materials of the products, you can reverse engineer the competitive products and see how they're being made and run a cost analysis on them. All this detective work is essential for setting the benchmarks for your product design in the marketplace. And then another important aspect that we do in design and engineering is failure modes and effects analysis. Quite often, designers are only concerned with form and function, and they don't get into the engineering aspect of design that is necessary for the product to compete in the marketplace and reduce the risk. It's imperative that you also combine the design engineering with the design aspects of the product development at the early end of the process so that you can incorporate the best mode, best practice into your design early on. It's something that's too difficult to change after you've built the tooling and built the plant and you're moving on into the marketplace. And then industry standards, there's a myriad of industry standards, but quite often by benchmarking what the competitive products are, how the customer is currently solving the problem, you can learn from those products what industry standards they're meeting and map them onto your constraints for your design challenge. It's not simply enough to just say, okay, I'm going to meet the standard. You need to also reference that standard and research it so you know what the benchmarks are there. Sometimes there's hidden benchmarks that are not obvious, and if you don't consider them in the process, you can move on assuming you're going to meet it just by, per se, using components that meet certain types of standards, but that is not enough. You need to look at it from the context of if someone's going to take this to a lab and run it through the process, is it going to pass that process? And most often, if you look into this distribution channel, say you're selling into a consumer marketplace, that buyer or that channel has a specification regarding standards and performance that you need to meet. Get that early in the process so that you know that you meet it, so it doesn't come later on when they're willing to buy your product, but you don't meet the standard because they require you to get third-party testing, that you fall out of the box. Moving on to principle number 4. Principle number 4 is identify the non-functional drivers of all stakeholders. So we discussed the functional drivers previously. Now we're talking about the non-functional drivers. And we need to discover those user choice drivers that affect the design experience. This is probably one of the more complicated areas that I find when teaching design, is that people can see the obvious, but when you're dealing with the behavioral aspects of the stakeholders of the supply chain, they're much less obvious, but they're just as important in understanding the design process for creating differentiation and also creating competitive advantage. So where do you go from the user choice drivers? So first we talk about behavioral drivers. Customers are not rational. They tend to be irrational, and there's a great book out there by Dan Ariely called Predictably Irrational. And these irrational aspects, these irrational economic drivers, are what often drive decisions in the marketplace. Many times products have these irrational drivers built into the user experience, and you need to understand them. Because if you develop a great product, but you're trying to change the behavior for that customer to use that product, that can often create a gap that you can't overcome in the marketplace. Loss aversion, endowment effect, we're going to discuss those a little more detail in the next slide. They're drivers that are very much present in the psyche of consumers, but very much also not very well understood in the process. Organizational pressure, so if you're moving into an organization and you're designing your product and say your distribution channel has certain elements of it that are necessary. For example, the distribution channel has decided that they don't want to deal with one product companies, they want multi-product companies, and you're a new startup with one product and you want to go through, or you need to go through that distribution channel, you have to have a strategy of addressing that situation. If that organizational pressure or that organizational strategy in your distribution channel contradicts your strategy of going to market, that's going to stop your efforts in efforts in the tracks. Another thing is cultural biases. Now, not all products have cultural biases, but some do. And when they do have cultural biases, those endowed effects on that culture are important. Again, you must look at the cultural biases in the context of the product and how you're bringing it to market so that you can design either into it or design a strategy to overcome it. Social drivers, cognitive drivers, competitive alliances, strategic partnerships, these are all elements of when you are analyzing that consumption chain, you're looking for the non-functional elements in those steps that can be impediments for you to get to the market, but also can be opportunities for you that if you conquer them, to differentiate your product amongst the competition. When we talk about the behavioral economics or the behavioral drivers, there's a theory that was put out about in the 1960s about behavior of how people value their transactions. And the name of that theory was prospect theory. There's two elements that relate primarily to design. One is called the endowment effect. Ownership creates satisfaction, meaning when I own something beyond its value in the marketplace, I typically will ascribe more value to it because it's mine. The second is loss aversion, and then that loss aversion is interesting that people are more motivated by avoiding a loss than achieving a gain. And that typically plays out when people own stocks, and that was part of the research that came about this. If you own a stock and you're invested in that stock, it's a sunk cost, you've created a relationship with it. You know it's going down and you can pull your money out even though it's a loss and put it into another stock that may gain, but it's very difficult to sell that stock because of this loss aversion behavior that we have. An example of the endowment effect would be I'm selling a car. The buyer says the market for the car is $1,000, I'll give you $1,000. But I say, no, I will only accept $1,500. This is my car, this is a great car. Now, the irrational aspect of this is if I was buying this car, I would probably take the same position the buyer has. In this scenario, once I own something, not having it becomes more painful because of the loss, and I believe it's more valuable because it's mine. We see this in transactions all the time. And this is the basis quite often of some brand building that when products are endowed into somebody's psyche, that they just do not want to let them go. Some people will only drink Coke and not drink Pepsi. They've endowed in that relationship that that's their soft drink. And also in loss aversion, in this prospect theory, is people value a thing more once it becomes theirs, and they emotionally outweigh the potential for the gain. So I own that stock. I don't want to take the loss on it, and in my mind, I don't take the loss on it until I sell it. Even though it may be going down and it may not be worth keeping, I have a hard time getting rid of it and taking that money and redeploying it somewhere else. This is often quite evident when people have a brand relationship in the market with a product. Even though the brand may not be fulfilling their needs, they rely on their past experience with that brand and they ascribe more value to it. So what does that mean in design? That means that typically when you bring out a new product, it cannot be just a little bit better. It has to be significantly better. Significantly better to drive the gap between the brand alliance and what the customer may see or perceive as better value for changing his alliances or allegiances to that brand. When you look at the behavioral drivers in the consumption chain, journey mapping is a great way to understand what's happening, but the journey mapping can get very convoluted and complex. There's no way around it. You need to look at all these particular areas, but in looking at these areas, you want to just identify those that have the possibility to create value for you in your design. So as you focus on how the customer is ordering the product per se. When Amazon came out with their one-click ordering, they found a pain point in online ordering that was a big problem back in the day, where you would have to continually enter a lot of information, and it was very difficult, it was very challenging to do an online order. Amazon, seeing that, they looked at that behavior and they said, if we can get down to one click, we can make the ordering process easy. And when they have a multiple choices of, at that time, books and music, when they have multiple choices to go online and get this information, we can make the process easier, thus capture the order. There's many behavioral drivers like this in the process. You need to identify them, brainstorm them, and look for ways to differentiate them along with the form and function of your product. There are also other cognitive considerations, and I think Don Norman's book, The Psychology of Everyday Things, is really good in identifying some of the basic cognitive behaviors that we see. And he focuses on three: affordances, mapping, and feedback. So on affordances in design, where one deals with real physical objects, Norman says there can be both a real and perceived affordance associated with that need. And you must deal with that at the same time. So this is an obvious example Norman uses as far as a coffee pot. When we see that pot with the spout and the handle on the same side, we know immediately it's not going to work. It doesn't work. That's our conscious relationship with those similar products in the past, mapping on to the new products coming out. On mapping, which I think is brilliant insight that Don had, he looks at the relationship between things and how they work. A classic example is how product control certain types of operations. And in looking at that, he used the example of a burner on a stove. And on the left here, you look at an arbitrary mapping where the buttons that control the burners really are not positioned in any way that gives you any clue as to what burner controls what knob controls what burner. He talks about a paired mapping, which by simply putting a box around each of the two controls, we get an idea that at least we know the controls on the left work for the burners on the left, and the controls on the right work for the burners on the right. But the best mapping is a full mapping. When you look at what is explained here, is that this full mapping shows the burners and a physical orientation of the knob so that we know what knob controls what burner without giving any other information, without having to train anybody. It's just a normal mapping. Another type of mapping Norman talks about is when you walk to a door. If you see a push bar, it means that it would push to go out. If you see a doorknob or a pull handle, you may believe that it pulls to come in. These mappings are unconscious drivers that we look at all the time. When you create a new product, oftentimes people have mapped their experience onto the old product and they don't like the change. Steve Jobs went through this process early on when he introduced the mouse into the computer industry. Now, Steve saw the mouse at Xerox. He thought it was a beautiful object. Apple optimized that mouse, and Steve wanted to bring that out with, I believe it was the Macintosh. But what happened is when they did the testing, people were used to using the up and down arrow keys, side to side arrow keys, and using the mouse caused them discomfort because they had to learn a new way of doing things. Even today, when you change mouses, like I'll use a mouse and I'll use a trackball, I use them with equal dexterity. But if someone sits in my computer in my office and they use my trackball and they've not used it before, they find it very difficult because they have to learn that behavior. So you have to design your product with the awareness that people have these mapping and affordance behaviors built into their psyche, and they will be part of that first experience with your product. Now, Steve Jobs took a bold move. What he did is he took the arrow keys off the keyboard and supplied the Macintosh with a mouse to force that behavioral change. That's quite a bold move, and that's a very risky move in the marketplace today. Feedback. Feedback is very important because particularly when we're doing something new, we don't know if we did the process right or wrong. And if you can incorporate feedback into the operation in your design, potentially if your feedback's better than the feedback of the competitive products in the marketplace, that's an opportunity for differentiation. Simple feedbacks are a power light when a unit is on, and a red light when the unit is off, or as simple as a telephone ringing. These forms of feedback are not conscious type experience drivers. They tend to be these unconscious subliminal type drivers that, one, you first need to understand what the users are used to, like the keyboard, and then where they can go to with your design if you have some new facility. The best designs create bridges between those behaviors so that users can use the product without changing their behavior. Very difficult to do. Moving on to principle number 5 now. Once you've mapped that chain, you've researched the functional needs, the non-functional needs, you then have to go through a process of looking at these needs and try to identify the unmet, undermet, or unarticulated needs. This is an essence of the design process because what we've learned in business, traditional marketing type surveys, etc., have fallen short in identifying unarticulated or unmet needs. That's because customers cannot tell you or users cannot tell you what they do not know. It's up to us as designers in exploring this process to delve into the experience such that we can observe them in a way to identify these unmet needs. This is a key area for beginning the design process to discover a point of differentiation. So we want to seek insights that create competitive advantage through design. Now, needs are framed in a number of different ways. You have functional and non-functional, but there's also the needs that the user has in using the product. And there's an interesting study of needs and people, and that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think if you haven't read anything about that, that would be interesting. But in order for us to appeal to the experience factor, though, that intangible love of a product, we have to appeal to the needs of those users and solve them so that they align and fit with the user's understanding of their hierarchy of needs. And they go through a number of different areas. There's physical, safety, social, esteem, self-actualization, and these combine to form what the users feel about their lives, how they do things, and can they associate your product experience with what they identify as unique to themselves. So, looking at functional needs, the social needs, the sustainability needs, financial needs or the needs of the business, cultural needs, cognitive needs, economic needs, convenience, and satisfaction, all these needs that we've identified previously in the process come forward now, and we have to seek and find those unmet insights that we can drive our design to. So, the question here at this point, when you're looking at needs, becomes a little more difficult because we can design only for a user, but if we design only for a user, we miss the other stakeholders in the operation. And this is a point of confusion that I find many times in design, where people, when they're doing their need finding, they tend to myopically focus on the user, but in design, we have to focus at all the stakeholders. Stakeholders being those partners in the supply chain, the partners in the distribution channel, obviously the people who buy the product and use the product and influence the product. Discussing stakeholders sometimes reminds me of the comedy routine of who's on first, what's on second, and you get into the position of, debating the identity of a user versus trying just to define the identity of the user and keep it consistent through your process. So who interacts directly with the product? Who manages the users? Who receives output from the product? who makes the purchasing decision, who uses competitor products, what are their unmet and unmet needs across that whole consumption chain. It's the interaction of identifying these needs across the consumption chain that leads to opportunities for differentiation. So a little question I like to ask a class is, suppose you're a company developing a new consumer toy product. I'll ask who are the users, and everybody will say kids, children. It's 100% on that. And then I'll say who are the influencers, and most everybody will say parents, some people will say teachers, which makes sense. And then I say who are the purchasers, and almost immediately everybody says the parents. Well, the parents are purchasers if you're a retailer, but if you're a manufacturer or a company developing a new toy, the purchaser is the retailer. And there's a big difference between what the retailer's needs are and what that parent's needs are. You have to understand both of those sets of needs in your analysis in order to design the product to fit. If you take only one and not the other, the chance that you're going to miss that opportunity to fit is very high. And that's a confusing type aspect of this analysis, but once you're aware of it, then it allows you to brainstorm and look for those unmet needs in all these areas, but you have to reframe it and put yourself in the position of different stakeholders in the operation. So what are the needs of all the stakeholders? Moving on to principle number 6. This principle is an interesting perspective because it takes a unique non-business view of looking at taking these needs and finding what opportunities are in a white space. The reason I say white space is that I'm looking for a space where the competition is not anchored and where even though if you hit the ball out of the park, you're still going to have a difficult time in switching users' behavior. And white spaces exist both in the marketplace but also technically. And they have to be designed in the white space in both the marketplace and the technical space in a complementary fashion such that the design itself gives you the best opportunity to have success in the marketplace. The goal is to add value in the business model and the technical white spaces. This is a mapping, a perceptual map of a product in the market. We'll go into that a little more detail. But how we do this is that we research the prior art in the patents, we research the active art in the patents, and we design in the technical white space. Now this used to be a very difficult challenge before, but today with the databases and the software that's out there, we can identify what's come before us. And that technical information that's come before us, that technical development is very important because if someone has a patent on a particular application in a market, they have a right to practice that patent as a monopoly now for 20 years. If your design comes up and is on top of that patent and potentially uses the novelty that that patent describes, you could have a great discovery, you could have a great product development, but you can be blocked from using that in the market because you're using somebody else's technology. Also, by researching the patents, you find out what the prior art was. And all patents are built on prior art. And there's an association between patents and references in prior art that's very similar to when you did a research paper in high school. When you did a research paper, you wrote about a particular topic, you cited previous areas of research that you built your evidence base for your paper on. It's the same way in patents, they're the same type of associations. The takeaway here is by searching patents, it gives you an insight into how other people have solved the problem and an insight into what is protected that you need to avoid or you need to work out with the patent holder in order to practice that technical development in the marketplace. Then you need to look at the competitive segments in the business, identify the segments with less competition, and you want to design into a market white space. Why would you want to do this? Well, quite often, spaces and competition within markets is illogical in itself. Many times companies will always choose to be the latest innovation and they bring the latest product with the most functionality in the market because they perceive that as being the highest value for them. But it doesn't always play out that way. Certain markets are hyper competitive in certain segments, and if you are choosing to go into a hyper competitive segment with a new product, if you don't have a breakthrough innovation, something that's a total game changer, you can end up running into the head-on into the competition, and even though your product may have some perceptible advantage, the ability to dislodge a customer from an existing competitor is going to be virtually impossible because companies will go out of business before they give up their customers. So there's a strategy here, a strategy that you want to design into the white space. So if we give you an example of the white space from a market position, we're looking at breakfast cereals, and we've looked at different breakfast cereals and we've mapped them out between bad taste and nutrition. And looking at the opportunity space in this breakfast cereal area was if you had something that was high nutrition and good taste, there would be an opportunity there for you to bring that product into the market. If there's not a lot of competitors there, that open space gives you a niche that you can exploit in the marketplace that is much less competitive. If you were going to drop down into the bad taste, high nutrition, that in itself could be a very crowded or very difficult situation because that's the most crowded space in this segment in this map. So understanding as you do the analysis of the competitive products and looking at where they position themselves to attract customers is a very important strategy in design. In the same way, you can map the technical space on the patents. And in certain areas of these topographical maps, you can look at certain points of technology of where there's active and prior art patents that are around certain types of technology that you possibly can see, is there a white space there or is there an area that I need to avoid technically in order to develop my product so that I will not get into a patent fight once I go out into the marketplace. Moving on to principle 7, you need to validate iteratively throughout the user testing. So testing and validation is an integral part to the design process. When we test, we use the scientific method, but the scientific method does not have to be a full-blown test that's going to take months. It can be a very simple test where you set up a hypothesis, you create an experiment that really hopefully only changes one variable. You run the experiment, you analyze the results, and then you do something with the results. And these iterative little design-based experiments based on the scientific method allow us to have actual information that we can make decisions from that are fact-based, that are evidence-based. All too often, design is associated with the creative process that doesn't rely totally on the scientific method, and people will start designing and making decisions without the evidence or without the facts. That can get you into trouble. You can fall in love with your idea, but you tend to be putting a blindfold on when it comes to how this is going to play out in the marketplace. So you need to validate the design solutions with functional mock-ups and prototypes throughout the process. Designers have created a way to, have developed a way to communicate ideas simply and rapidly to get feedback. And quite often there's an evolution of an idea. An idea can be on the back of a napkin at first, and then it can be taken out through a drawing later. You could do a rapid prototype or a non-functional mock-up to get some insights and feedback. And as you do this, what you're doing is you're validating your choices with users early in the process when you have the most opportunity to respond to a failure. And we often say that in design we fail our way to success. Now, the opposite of that, on the other end of the spectrum, is you don't do any testing and you develop the product all the way to the end. You go out and get the tooling, you build the plant, you put it out to the users, and you find fundamental flaws in your assumptions. That is the worst feeling in the world, and many people do pursue things that way. And maybe years ago you could even get away with that if there wasn't a lot of competition in the market. It is no longer that way today, and the best practices are to create prototypes and use virtual prototyping to understand what you're working on and convey that to a user, convey that to a stakeholder so that you can get the feedback necessary to make the changes early on in the process. This little mapping shows some of the evolution of different types of methods that we use as we go through getting that validation with users. How we do that is with sketching and CAD models, virtual prototypes. I believe most designers need to be conversant in CAD or modeling software so that you can design directly into the software. Sketching is great in using it, but to really convey the three-dimensional experience with a product, you can create a product in CAD and virtually give an experience to a user to get the best possible feedback long before you've invested heavily in the mock-ups and prototypes. Then once you create those virtual prototypes, mock-ups and proof of concept models are great ways to put the product out, particularly to get functional feedback on the performance of your design. These work-like models and look-like models are the beginning of the design process, or beginning of putting that design process into stone and locking down your functional and form factors so that you can get the feedback from users and suppliers and stakeholders, distribution channel people, in order to see that you're on the right track for hiring that, for creating a product that customer is willing to hire that product to solve their problem. Another area that I like to talk about is MacGyver type prototypes. Now, if you didn't ever see the show MacGyver, this may be a strange name to you, but MacGyver was a guy that in the show every week he found himself in the world trying to solve a problem. It was always the nuclear bomb's going to blow up or something terrible was going to happen. And MacGyver found a way of solving the problem by using duct tape and paper clips and whatever he could find around to create that device that he needed to save the world. And the MacGyver mentality is a very, very good mentality in product development, because quite often we can take a device from another area or the same area and implement our design strategy or our design change in this device and then test it. And that relieves us of the need of going out and creating all the other elements of that device that are really non-differentiators or common elements that you can use. So it really is helpful to get a MacGyver mentality when prototyping, because it can get you from point A to point B much quicker in a very efficient and with good feedback possibilities. And then finally, functional prototypes. These are pre-production prototypes made rapid prototyping materials or rapid methodologies that are the prototypes that you go to the user with and you do the final confirmation prior to investing in tooling and prior to investing into the plant. These also are called pilot production models. So an example of looking at the consumption chain and trying to identify needs in a consumption chain that will lead to competitive advantages is a creation of a product that I call the Bit Doctor. It's a new multi-driver. And I have a product line that's a wrench, and I needed a companion product to bring into the marketplace. And I looked at the marketplace, and screwdrivers really go hand in hand with wrenches in the distribution channel. Though they have different supply chains as you go to sell them, and the branding and the recognition, it works in the distribution channel. But when I looked at the screwdrivers in the distribution channel, I found that there was quite a challenge here, that you can buy these 21-piece screwdriver sets. When we started years ago, it was $24.95. Last year I saw one for $9.95. And in doing that, that's quite a challenge to meet our goals of producing an American-made product at a price point that is competitive. So the challenge here was, how do I get the functionality and solve the problem of a 21-piece screwdriver set, but really not having the ability to have that supply chain that they rely on for that. So in designing or looking at the consumption chain, looking at the needs, I looked at the particular products that were in the market. I found that I needed Phillips and bladed tips. I needed long and short shafts. I needed magnetic, for holding the screws, a magnetic tip. People like ratcheting and non-ratcheting. There's a bunch of different sizes and lengths of the shafts. There's an issue with developing torque for tight screws. And I had to have a benchmark to compete against the low-cost imported sets. The real challenge here was, when I looked at these sets and I looked at the cost just of the raw materials, if I were to try to duplicate this in the US, it would be impossible. There's just no way to do that. So my challenge was, how do I solve that need for the user in a way that I could build this product in the States, but also have a product that's differentiated enough to hit that value-added price. So I'm going to show you a video here of the product that we came up with, and after the video I'm going to discuss a couple of the design points that reinforce the principles we talked about.
The Bit Doctor is a revolutionary new American-made 21-in-1 screwdriver system that fits into your pocket. Loggerhead has designed 10 innovations into the Bit Doctor to save you time, effort, and money. Extra bits allow us to fit 20 bits into a bit carrier the size of an adult finger, and with the 1/4 inch driver, this equals 21 screwdrivers in one. More than twice the drivers are the closest, all in one system. You simply rotate the driver out of the body like a pocket knife to the desired position. You have a closed position, standard driver, 3 ergonomic positions, and a right-angle driver position. The driver adapts to your work environment. You don't have to be a contortionist to get into all those tight and awkward hand positions. The angle created by the ergonomic position of the handle creates much more leverage than a standard screwdriver, making it easy to tighten or loosen a stuck screw. We simply spin the shaft until the screw is finger tight and slightly pushing forward. Then you engage the ratchet to easily applying the torque. The Bit Doctor has a slim, narrow profile. Unlike a standard screwdriver handle, the Bit Doctor fits comfortably into your pocket, purse, or glove box. All of the components easily attach and store into a driving system that is the size of a pocket knife. One Bit Doctor 21:1 gives you 21 of the most popular screwdrivers, 6 adjustable driving positions, and 3 adjustable lengths that combine to offer you over 370 possible combinations to get the job.
So we just saw a video of our Bit Doctor product, and there's a lot of form and function there that was used to overcome the amount of raw materials and components necessary to compete with that 21-piece screwdriver set. But I also wanted to give you some examples of some of the other elements we discussed in understanding what the process was and how this process validated with users in order to create a product that they would pay for that had some other advantages that the needs of that 21-piece screwdriver set were not being met. One of the things that's unique is we call this the Bit Doctor. It fits in your pocket. And in creating a name identity, which we're going to discuss later, we wanted to create an identity that itself was a source identifier. And we looked at a bunch of different names, and the name Bit Doctor actually came up to the point that we use a sort of a metaphor. It's a Bit Doctor because it's secure for the common screwdriver. And this product itself is now, it has the function of a screwdriver, but it moves into another space because we have the utility of that 21-piece set, but we have it in a package that is very small and compact. And the design allowed us to cut out a lot of the cost, but also create some features that are unique. One of the emotional drivers we talked about before was feedback. And in designing the product, I wanted obviously to have feedback. So as I open up this Bit Doctor, you could hear snapping. And at each point where the driver moves to the new position, when it gets into position, there's a detent that gives a little bit of a snapping sound. That gives the user the confidence that they've moved it and the security that it feels good. And I could have designed it without it. I had some early prototypes, but in the validation process, it was sort of moving around like a hex key set does. It didn't have that confident feel. And as I looked at the detents, what I found was when I could design it so that it closed and it was like the feeling of a car door slamming, it gave the user that confidence that they have a quality product in their hands. And then another thing in user design, as we were doing the ethnographic research, basically looking at how people solved the problem, I very simply set up a number of stations where I put a bunch of screwdrivers out, and I looked at how users would use screwdrivers to accomplish a job, changing a battery in a computer or a doll, unscrewing a cabinet, just doing different types of screwing operations that you'd use normal screwdrivers for. And I didn't jump in and tell them how to do it. I just basically watched to see what took place. And in doing that, I've had a unique observation that was a great opportunity for us to create a differentiation with the driver. What we found was when people were putting screws and starting screws into their apparatus, they would take the screw and they would pick it up and they would use their thumb and forefinger. With the thumb and forefinger, they were able to securely start that screw, and while it was loose, they would spin it in. That thumb and forefinger is a natural motion that's involved with this process, but I got to tell you, if we'd done a normal research and a normal questioning like a marketing study, no one would have said that's what they do. But consistently from users to users, we saw elements of that same thumb and forefinger motion. Well, what that did is that provided for me an insight. How can I use that natural motion in designing this new driver that maps on to that existing behavior? And even though that people are totally unaware of it, once they see it and try it, that connects with them. And there's typically, and I've had a lot of feedback that they like that because it just feels comfortable. So what I did, a normal ratchet doesn't really give you that type of thumb and forefinger. So I created a ratchet that itself is what I call freewheeling. You can use the thumb and forefinger motion, and with that you can spin that fastener in until it's tight. Then as you push it into the apparatus, say if it's on a wall or into a computer, you push it, it locks. And that locking motion allows this ratchet to torque at a fairly high level, because normal screwdrivers are straight. You can only develop the amount of torque around the moment arm of a handle. But as you bend this handle now becomes a lever multiplying the force. Now, if you're a professional and very strong hands, that may not be as big an issue. But if you're an older person or a younger person without the hand strength, that becomes a big issue many times. Also, when I looked at the 21-piece screwdriver set, they had short stubby screwdrivers with the same tips, and then they had longer ones with the same tips. And that was the same tip, more metal, more handle. And there was a duplication of handle and metal materials that were not necessary for the function. So I designed the Bit Doctor so that it had a stubby function built into it. You could have it as a stubby ratchet or a direct drive ratchet, all through using the same components in different configurations, all magnetically coupled, that allowed it to work. And then the bits were stored in the bit carrier inside the body, so the bits were always with you. So through the process of understanding how the customer was solving the problem, I was able to identify some insights into how the product was used and use that as a sort of a goal for me to design and achieve that new value creation, that new experience within a very crowded marketplace. And at the same time, do it in an embodiment that allowed me to build the product in the States, but compete with the low-cost import products. Not on as many drivers and all the metal and all the work, but through design adding value in a unique way. And obviously, that also gave me opportunity to create intellectual property around the Bit Doctor that built the identity and gives me protection in the marketplace from copiers. Principle number 8 is about co-creating a novel identity, meaning, and experience early in the design process and allowing it to flow through the design process as you're developing the rest of the product. And the reason I think this is important is that oftentimes people will create a product and they don't look at the overall availability of creating identity, and the identity that's mapped onto that product doesn't always jive, it doesn't fit, and it becomes a unconnected type relationship. And consumers can sniff out something that doesn't really have value in the meaning. So if you can, at the same time as you're developing your product and you're creating that form, you can think about identity, you can create that meaningful experience that we talked about early on. So you want to design that novel identity of your new product experience. You want to do that early in the process and continue it through the whole design process. So when design creates an identity, and when you have success in the marketplace, that identity will translate to brand, and brand value is critically important for large companies. How important? Well, there was a study about 10 years ago where they analyzed the Fortune 500 companies, and they looked at the market cap, the total value of those companies, and the relationship between tangible assets and intangible assets. Now, brand value and intellectual property are intangible assets, and what they found that close to 75% of the market capitalization of those companies was built on a brand identity. But I maintain you cannot build a good brand if you do not create a good identity in the design phase. And that's the interrelationship between design and business that is most often overlooked, and that what we take advantage of here in differentiation by design. The fact that you can take in the design stage and build in these business type levers that once you have successful in the market, success in the market, these levers can translate to company value, are extremely important. But once the product's in the market and it has not been done sufficiently, it's almost impossible to go back and grab it. So the power of design in business is early in the stage of understanding those business needs and making them part of the needs for the business as you go through your design process. We do this by getting a unique product name, product logo, company logo, product mantra, company mantra, color scheme, company icon, company mascot, non-traditional marks. Now this seems like a lot of cart before the horse, and in some ways it could be, but if you're bringing the marketing people and the other business stakeholders into the design process, this is an area where they can interact with the process from their expertise and their positions to create complementary value creators as you design this process. As I said before, with the Bit Doctor, we came up with the name and we looked at the different types of aspects of it so that the function of the product could complement that marketing that we were bringing to it. A great example of this is written about in the Wall Street Journal, The Shape of Things to Come. Professor Connolly and Orozco, both were at Northwestern at the time. Professor Connolly is still here. But they analyzed how Apple was integrating this value creation in the design process to create a design language for their products that leveraged itself in identity later on as intellectual property that were able to be used in the marketplace. And this was talking about the iPod. And if you look at the various generations of the iPod, there are certain elements of the click wheel, the window, the shape that they created into the process, and they carried it through successive platform generations of that product that became a source identifier for that experience. That became very important because if someone tries to knock you off and steal your identity, if you have not sufficiently protected it, it becomes a difficult challenge to protect yourself in the marketplace. But Apple has created this and leveraged it in a tremendous way in the market. And if you look at the evolution of the iPods, without a doubt, you can see that design language that they rely on. And then they did something unique. They not only went for the traditional trademark and the patents on the particular functional aspects, but they did a design patent on the products in their various embodiments, and then they went later on in those design patents, they filed for trademarks on those elements. This multiple levels of competitive patenting or protecting with intellectual property, they come together in the multiple regimens of protection to give a very broad fence around competitors, knocking them off. And thus, by combining elements of utility patents, design patents, copyrights, trademarks, and in this design language, it becomes a very formidable wall around your technology. And it really raises the bar for someone trying to come in after you've had success to knock you off. And it's, quite frankly, one of the reasons Apple's been so successful. Now, this is the iPod, but an example of that is Apple just won a giant award against Samsung last year. And this award was based on the swipe motion, the shape of the product, a number of different IP elements of the same strategy being applied to cell phones. Moving on to principle number 9 is integrate multiple value creators into your design. Showing up on the right here, the value chain. So the value chain to business, Michael Porter's value chain, is really the documentation of all the activities where somebody is adding value in that product experience. And when you have competitors, if they're all adding the same value, the products would be undifferentiated. Probably would only be selling on cost. But if you can create a value chain that has significant differentiators that the customer is willing to pay for, that really gives you a position in the marketplace to beat the competition. And this really plays out, it plays out when you're a new entrant into the market. So if you're an entrepreneur going into a market, you're not only just creating a new product, but you're creating a new supply chain, a new distribution channel, you're pioneering a company, and you're pioneering the product, going into a competitive space that is a very, very challenging quest. as opposed to being a dominant in the marketplace and maybe line extending. So the challenge here is to create enough competitive advantage in the value chain to sufficiently overcome what competition's in the market. To review, we talked about multiple value creators in the consumption chain that would flow to the value chain. We talked about understanding the behavioral aspects and the other needs beyond just form and function. We talked about creating value in areas that are non-traditional so that that value can translate into competitive advantage. And when you integrate these multiple values into your design, you get successful products that are based on these multiple competitive advantages. It's a systems view of the product development process. It's looking at the business and the product development, the supply chain, the lean design, the design engineering, all the elements that come together to give you that special place that's going to allow you to be successful in the market. We do this by a lean supply chain, and lean is a type of design thinking that is about creating value by lowering cost. Lean in itself for the last 20 years was seen as a differentiator, and many companies leaned out their chain and used that to lower their price in the marketplace. But today, that's an operationally effective technique, as Porter would say, because if everybody's leaning out their product, it's table stakes now. It's no longer a competitive advantage. You have to have a lean supply chain in order to be competitive. But lean goes beyond the supply chain. The way you run your business, your distribution channel, there's a number of strategies in the lean design that allows you to see competitive advantages. So for the Bit Doctor, we didn't choose to go offshore where there's a natural lean supply chain, but I designed the product in a modular way, taking advantage of the best high volume production methods here in the States so that I can get cost advantages out of productivity, working with strategic alliances with suppliers that allow me to position myself to be competitive in that market space. So it's a multiplicity of strategies, and just simply going offshore is not the strategy to guarantee you a leading supply chain, because there's no value or there's nothing stopping anybody else from also going offshore. And when you design to just reduce cost, which you need to do, you need to always optimize it. It's a diminishing return, and there's, the lower you get, you run up against the wall. But when you're adding value on the other side of creating the willingness to pay, and you're raising that, you have a lot of room there to raise that, to allow for an economic situation that you can leverage in the marketplace through that added value. Another multiple value creator is strategic partnerships. You're not going this alone. If you take the supply chain and distribution channel, you can partner in that supply chain and distribution channel to leverage the best practices of your partners so that you don't have to redundantly invest in them. So I don't build the Bit Doctor. I have a supply chain that builds it for me, thus I don't have that investment that I've had to make. I strategically found suppliers that had already had a sunk cost in making bits and making drivers and shafts and molding that were able to give me competitive prices and still make money themselves so that I can assemble a product that then can go out into the marketplace. That's critically important in design to early on identify that, because if I would have designed that whole product and then after it was designed and ready to go to the market and I'm looking at suppliers, they can only quote me what they can make or what they're capable of doing. But what I did is early on I worked with those suppliers and I said, okay, how can we build these bits and how can we do this in the best possible way for you to get the best possible productivity out of your process that can translate so you can be more competitive for me and I'm more competitive in the marketplace. And involving those suppliers early on in the process is a great way to get the best available technology applied to your design, and it allows you to build on those strategic partnerships to offset the low-cost competition that's being imported. But there's a danger here that you have to be aware of. In the relationships of design and development, there's power in different types of relationships. It's key for you to have control of the intellectual property, as we've talked about before, so that when a supplier gets you and you say sole sourced with a supplier here in the States, that you've got power in that relationship, because you do not want to be get out into the marketplace and be held up later so that you can't make money in the market as they raise prices. That comes into the relationships that you establish early on. Most of the product costs, particularly for the differentiating elements of products, are developed in the design process. When you work with suppliers early on, you're gaining information from them, but they're also locking into your supply chain. If you work with a supplier and you don't create an understanding, a supply chain agreement up front, and you don't create costing metrics that you can rely on long term, you can sort of paint yourself into a corner with a supplier, creating a problem that could flare up later on when you least expect it. Thus, what I like to do is I like in the beginning to use multiple suppliers of similar type components so that one, I have a little bit of competition there too, and I'm getting the best process ideas for developing the product and getting efficiency and productivity early on in the process. Those suppliers that seem the best, I talk to them and I negotiate at that time our supply chain agreement so that later on, after I've made that decision and I built the tooling and I'm down the pathway, I don't have any surprises with pricing or delivery, etc. So this is critical in design, is integrating that into the design process early on, because if you do not do that, you can paint yourself into a corner. Intellectual property is another area that you have to integrate into this process early on. And that, as we talked about before, when you do your analysis of the competitive products and you're doing your analysis of the market space, when you do your patent analysis, that will allow you to see what prior art's out there, what art's out there that's protected, and where you potentially have a white space to design into. I find that doing this research and challenging yourself is the opportunity, it gives me the best opportunity to design a differentiation. If I had not done the analysis of the screwdriver market and looked at how people use them, and I had not immersed myself in that storming process, I would not have been challenged at all the points along the way to come up with a better way of doing that. And each of those components has a story associated with how I was seeking to overcome a problem in a unique way. It's that process, that storming process, that iterative process of bringing all the elements together that creates your ultimate value chain. And it creates the multiple points of differentiation that gives you competitive advantage. Platform design, I brought another example here. So this was the Bit Doctor that I showed you before that has the ratchet on it. But I wanted to platform this, so if I wanted a lower price point product, one product to say I could do is I can cut the ratchet out and still have a traditional driver that had all the functionality. So I designed a longer driver that fit the body and the hub of this existing product so that I have two different products simply by changing one shaft and driver out to the other. This is called platform design, and this platform design is very helpful for companies in order to create other types of products to go into other segments. In platform design, I was sharing tooling as far as tooling for the bodies, sharing bits, sharing the bit holder tooling, and even making it on the same shaft that the other shafts are made on. Another area where you get multiple value creators in your design is quality systems. And this is an area that can be confounding at times. Now, you have to have a quality system, and quality is critically important to product design. But the quality system is often dictated by the final use. So if you're a supplier in the automotive industry has a certain set of quality systems that they rely on and they require their supply chain to deliver. If you're selling into the consumer product industry, there's another set of supply chain requirements. It's very important early on when you're analyzing the market to look at how the product was going to be sold in the end use and what the supply chain quality system is required for that market. Now sometimes they can be open or sometimes there are multiple ones, but quite often, if you're going into a medical supply system or you're going into a government military type project, they are very, very specific on what you can do. It's key to understanding this up front so that you do not develop your product with suppliers that don't have that supply system. And supply systems can vary as quality. The quality systems can vary amongst suppliers and it's predominantly dependent on the marketplace that they serve. Now, when I was looking for my supplier for my bionic wrench, I looked at what the retailers were looking at, and they required that we meet ASTM specs. So I looked at the ASTM specs and found that the wrench did not really fit the wrench spec or the plier spec, and I had a quandary. What do I do? I want to be able to meet the specifications, so I contacted ASTM. They're not going to create a new spec for a product at the time. They recommended I take the applicable specs from the pliers and the applicable specs from the wrench and combine them. I did that, and as we did the testing and going through the third-party testing with the suppliers, we met those specs. But that required me up front to realize that my jaws had to be hardened to a certain Rockwell hardness. There had to be, the handles had to bend before they break, because that was the way they want failure. They don't want a brittle failure that someone pulls on a wrench and it snaps and they fall off a ladder. They would rather it break, bend, and then if it bends, it's not an event that's going to throw somebody with the momentum off the ladder. There's a number of these elements. My advice is to look at the final use of the product, and as you're looking at standards and as you're looking at the different elements of the constraints, to understand the quality specs of that market. So my bionic wrench, what I did was, I didn't have a very tight quality spec. I mean, it had to have a quality system that was ISO certified, and ISO certifies a number of different systems, but I had to have an ISO certified system. But in looking at the supply chain, that was the possibility, with the one that most suited my production method was stamping, and looking at the market that stamping served at the highest level of quality, I saw that the best opportunity for me was to find a relationship with automotive suppliers, because the automotive supply chain is audited, the culture is very well ingrained. Companies that are in that chain, they do this every day, and that's what they're good at. Now, I could have gone to one of the automotive suppliers that I started with and said I want a different quality chain, and they would have told me, oh, sure, we'll do that. But the reality is they're going to do what they do every day on a daily basis, and if your product is something that's different, something's going to fall through the cracks. So rather than coming in and over-specifying my demands onto the supply chain, I said, what is the system that you use? Are you ISO certified, and how do you use that system? And as I developed the specifications for the product in that system, I focused on the one that the supplier was good at doing on a daily basis, and I was not changing their behavior. Ergonomics is a design process that is very important for the use of the product. And as I designed the product, I would create functional models and test them with people to optimizing the handle, the feel, the grip, the length of the grip, the different elements there, so that I could optimize it. And it's a trade-off. Like everything in design, you run into trade-offs. You can get very ergonomic grips for a certain segment of the population, but by definition, it may not be a good grip for the other segment of the population. You can't have different grips out on the marketplace for this product. So what you get into the situation is you look at the evidence from your testing and you make a trade-off of the design that's the cost-effective design that has the ability to satisfy the needs of the predominant market that you're going to sell into. Managing trade-offs and handling this aspect of the design process is critically important for the designer. Universal design considerations falls along with ergonomics. I did not, I originally had a lock on the unit, and after doing testing with users who buy the wrench, it was predominantly female users, I pulled the lock off because they had difficulty because they didn't have the normal mapping of tools that professionals had. And our product was skewed towards gift product, and it was very giftable, thus there was a different buying segment. I went to that aspect that buying segment was used to, which was no lock, and then no left hand, no right hand. It was an ambidextrous use. There were a lot of principles of equitable use and universal design that became part of the process. In recyclability, I looked at using components that could use recyclable content. All our packaging has recyclable content, and that in the packaging, which is quite often an opportunity for recycling but is overlooked, we created a package that in itself, we didn't laminate the plastic to the paper. Now, Most companies do. It's a simple thing. But when you get that package at home and you're going to separate the paper from the plastic for recycling, if the paper is heat laminated or glued to the plastic, it destroys its ability to be recycled. There's plenty of opportunities for end-to-use recyclability in design, and this is an area that you want to integrate into your multiple value creators. Social networks, the ability to build awareness with your product, particularly a new product in the market, is really critical. So as we designed our product, we looked to capture the possibility of getting design awards and bringing focus to our product that in themselves are a way of building awareness without making that investment. And PR is a great way to do that. In getting PR for your product, it's more valuable than spending money on advertising, because PR gives an endorsement effect. So if your product can captivate somebody who's writing or who's passionate about that product area, and they are motivated enough to write about your product and endorse it by their writing, that gives you a tremendous amount of street credibility in the marketplace that you can leverage as you pioneer that product into the market. And sustainability. So sustainability, as we discussed before, is the premise, and we look at it in the context of economic sustainability, meaning the company needs to make money. Environmental sustainability, so you're not creating an environmental mess, that you're using the best available practices to produce the product that reduces any chance of safety issues or chances of pollution. And then there's social responsibility, which for us became a source identifier in the fact that we have an American-made product. And at context of being able to build the product in the States, we've leveraged in the marketplace with that sustainable nature that design adds value, and that value can create a competitive advantage, and you can earn more money in the market, build it in the build it in the marketplace for selling it, so we have that contextual relationship that we're not relying on just arbitraging labor or different environmental or safety regulations, where we believe we're doing it the right way. This is the key to, I believe, this innovation challenge. If you can't bring an innovative product out in the market that you're going to be selling it into, you got to question what products are going to be able to be built in that marketplace. And if we can't get that innovation promise working such that we can create products that create jobs, that create tax dollars in a way, we're not going to have a sustainable marketplace in order to sell into the future. So this value is created in all areas, showing from the supply chain to the manufacturing company, the website, how people see the product, all the different distribution channels throughout that whole consumption chain. And it's the combination of the multiplicity of value creators. Some are very strong, some are just small, but that combination of value is what gives you a lot of power in the marketplace. One of the other things that I like to look at is that form factor we dealt with earlier today. So we normally will ask, what is this product? And if you haven't been in the design world, it looks like a head scratcher or some kind of tongs for a barbecue, but it actually is a juicer. And this product was designed at a high form factor. I have one at home. It's a beautiful product. It's not the best juicer, but I don't juice that much. But it's an inspiration from its ability to emotionally connect with me. If you can get those emotional connections in your design along with the form and function, that's a very strong multiple value creator. And that's a process of design that typically is difficult to control because you don't know what the final form is. So my process is that I like to work on the functional area first. The function will typically drive me to a unique form. And then from that form factor, I'm continually trying to find optimization in the form that gives me a unique source identifier along with my unique function. So moving on now to the final principle 10, and that's monetize a new product and a new business model. And this is where the business and the design come together in a formidable competitor in the marketplace. If you've been able to use the previous 9 principles in optimizing your design to create new value and competitive advantage, quite often, particularly in new companies, you have the ability to also look at that business model as a way of differentiating the whole overall product experience. And they can be a very powerful differentiator in combination. The thing here that really gives the opportunity, so when you're, say you're an entrepreneur and a new company coming out, you don't have the You don't have the pre-existing relationships and the supply chain, the distribution channel. You're pioneering everything for the first time. And that's a formidable challenge. But the one advantage you do have is that you're entering the market without the legacy relationships that may have become uncompetitive over the years. So if I'm a company and I've worked in a marketplace, or maybe where I'm a manufacturer, I sell to a wholesaler who then sells to a retailer, to the customer, there's a number of mouths in the food chain. And as what's taken place in the last 20 years is those multi-step chains that used to be prevalent because we didn't have the access to transportation like we do now and the access to information like we do now. They were necessary for the distribution. But they've become burdensome in that everybody steps on the price a bit in order to get that done in the marketplace. So when you're bringing out a new product and you run up against one of these old types of chains and the competition's doing that, there's opportunity in the value chain possibly to go direct or to cut one of the mouths out of the food chain that allows you to be more competitive. And you, because of the new technology available in the web or distribution channels or whatever, you can become much more efficient in that business model. And an entrepreneurial startup, there's plenty of opportunity in the supply chain, the business model, the way you run the company, and in the distribution channel to develop that new business model that complements getting the product to market. The one caution here is if the buyer is used to buying a certain way and they're resistant to that change, your new business model may not be sufficient to convince them to change that behavior. So you have to analyze that business model the way you do all the other functional and non-functional choice drivers to understand what that opportunity is and if there's an opportunity there in the business model. But there are other opportunities in the business model beyond the distribution channel. It's the supply chain. It can be in the way the company is financed. It could be in the overhead of the company. There's any number of opportunities. So designing a new business model is one of the most powerful ways to succeed. This is a graphic of a book that's very, very good in tackling business models and looking at the different business models that are out there. It's called the Business Model Development. An example would be you may take the razor blade approach. That means you may want to get your razors out in the market at a cheap price so they buy only your blades because only your blades fit with your razor. That's a very powerful business model for a lot of companies that have that tie-in sale relationship. You may have a business model like Southwest Airlines where you are serving a certain segment of the market and you're doing it at a high efficiency, high productivity, low cost way, and you do it in such a way that other people cannot compete dollar for dollar, head for head for that passenger mile. And then they differentiated early on in what's called price management, price yield management, in where they developed an online presence for booking flights that had different prices at different times that met different needs, and it allowed them to fly their planes at higher capacity. So how we do this, how we monetize a new product in a business model, is we look at the key activities, we look at the value proposition, the customer relationship, market segments, key resources, distribution channels, costs, price yield management, like I mentioned, like the airlines are using, agile development so that we keep the development costs low and the investment costs low, and risk management. This whole process comes together is a risk. The risk of bringing new products to the market, and historically it has been prone to a lot of failure. And a lot of failure starts with a number of elements in these principles that I've talked about, but one of them is not working and not focusing on the right problems. You saw it the segue. Risk management is key today because there's just not a lot of opportunity to miss the target and survive. And the flexibility in design and the ability to upfront understand the needs and validate them before you sunk your cost into tooling and plants is what's known today as agile development. It's taken off from the software development, and the key to it is that you can pivot according to what the needs are that you've developed in your analysis in order to optimize your design to complement those multiple differentiators across that consumption chain. That process by being on target and staying on target and validating it, reduces the development risk and raises the chance of success within this whole process. So, Michael Dell had a lean business model. The story of Michael Dell is that Michael Dell started in his college dorm room assembling computers. And he assembled computers for people who wanted computers on campus, but the standard computers that were out there took a long time, or they were very expensive to procure, but he developed an expertise in the drivers, the memory, and the software, and all the elements of bringing a computer together to make it work. Back at that time, it was much more difficult to do things than it is today. It was early on in the computer technology, and things just didn't fall together. So he used his expertise in putting these computers together to get competitively priced computers for people that were high-need users in a way that was, cheaper and more cost-effective and better service than a lot of the big companies. And this scaled up out of his dorm room into a small computer company that continued to grow and grow. And what he had stumbled upon, he didn't know this ahead of time, was that there was a niche to go direct to the consumer for a custom-made computer at a fair price. And what that evolved to was a very, very well-executed website that allowed computers to be ordered on the web by the user. Not that you could talk to somebody on the line, but if you could do it on the web, that was even better for him because he didn't have to pay to take the order. They customized their computers, and Dell set up a brilliant supply chain where he was making the computers at that time domestically. His suppliers were within a short distance to his gate. Once the customer placed the order actually for the components went to the supplier. The supplier delivered the next day the components. He had a production line like Henry Ford. The orders flowed through into the production system, and he was building custom computers, putting in the components that the users wanted, and configuring the software up front, which was very important because back then software configuration was a nightmare. And he controlled that by only having certain qualified products that he knew worked with his combination of systems, so he didn't run into all the conflicts of drivers, etc. He created this process that was a very, very efficient system for getting computers. And it really appealed to large organizations that were buying a lot of computers and putting them on a system and a network in a way to standardize their systems based on what the research and development that Dell did. But there was another hidden advantage here that was unbelievable in the business model. The biggest problem startup companies have when they create a new product and they have success is funding that success, because if you all of a sudden have to start building a lot of products, there's a lot of cash flow. If you're set up in a business model where you're bringing your products in from offshore, you may have to pay for that product up front and not see that product for 60 days. And by the you get it into your inventory system, maybe it's 90 days. That's 90 days of cash that you don't have, that's out in the you can't use in your organization. You have to find it somewhere. You have to sell stock to raise money. You have to try and borrow it, which is very difficult for a small company. But offshoot of Dell, what he found in his process was that when people bought a Dell computer, they actually paid for it with a credit card. And he built it right away and shipped it, but he didn't pay his suppliers for 60 or 90 days because that was the going pay plan in the industry. All of a sudden, he had a positive cash flow as he grew. That was a tremendous advantage for Dell as he was growing to scale up and not having to sell off all of his company or not having to go out and borrow all this money, but he used the business model to generate cash at a time where he needed cash. And he continued to reinvest in the process, and IBM is gone and Compaq's gone. A lot of companies didn't make it. Dell is still here. Now, they've evolved from this model, but they still use this model online, but he's bringing a lot of products in from offshore right now. But I believe that this is a classic example of how the business model can play out for competitive advantage in a marketplace. So, recapping, these are the 10 principles of differentiation by design. Thanks for listening today, and I appreciate your attention.